Hello, this is Professor Wagner, Macroeconomics, Chapter 2, Choice in a World of Scarcity. Chapter you can see as follows. It's how individuals make choices based on their budget constraint. There's an assumption that individuals will always make rational choices, the production possibilities frontier, and social choices, and confronting objections to the economic approach. Generally speaking, all consumers of services and goods have to make choices and determine for themselves the trade-offs of their choices. The case here in this particular slide, they are saying the higher the degree, the higher the salary. And so why aren't more people pursuing higher degrees? And it's basically choices and trade-offs. So what are those? Well, to choose to get a higher degree, if you do not get a sponsorship or a scholarship for, let's say, a graduate degree, then you're going to have to pay for it yourself. You'll have to determine your return on your investment of actually getting that degree and whether or not you can pay for it. So the trade-off might be is, gee, this is great, but I don't really have the money for it, or the return on my investment isn't quite good enough, so I may forego the higher degree, or maybe the criteria meets it as such that you would choose for the higher degree because you see a positive return on investment. This is an example of choices and trade-offs. In the world of individuals making choices based on their budget constraints, there's also a combined opportunity set. So if you have a couple of goods and a budget amount, the budget constraint can be illustrated graphically. Also, with a limited amount of income to spend on things, they have to choose what they need and want. Typically needs supersede wants. So it could be that I need water, and so that will take precedence over, let's say, something like chocolate. This slide is an illustration of the previous. Basically, we're using Alphonso's consumption choice, and the two items are burgers and bus tickets. And he has a budget of $10. So burgers cost $2 and bus tickets cost 50 cents. So each point on the budget constraint is a combination of burger or bus tickets whose total cost adds up to his budget, meaning that he can not spend any more than $10. The slope of the budget constraint is by the relative price of burgers and bus tickets. And giving up one burger in this particular case means 4 tickets for the bus. The opportunity set, every point on the constraint will show a combination of burgers and bus tickets that Alphonso can afford. That point could also fall within the slope of the graph. So underneath the slope, if there's a point that falls there, that is also within his grasp. He does not have to spend all of his money. And any point outside the constraint, which would be above the line in this particular graph, means that the combinations that he would like to choose simply cost more than he has. The concept illustrated previously is the concept of opportunity cost. So this once again is about trade-offs, and the cost of one item is a lost opportunity to do or consume something else. And so the opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative. And every choice has an opportunity cost. For Alphonso, a burger is worth 4 bus tickets. So if he buys a burger, he would give up the opportunity to buy 4 bus tickets. So that's the trade-off. Often opportunity cost is also referred to the price of the good or service. And the price sometimes is measured in dollars, may not always accurately capture the true opportunity costs, such as the cost of time when that's involved. So the example they give is attending college. The out-of-pocket cost of college includes not only tuition, books, room and board, and other expenses. It also costs time, the time you're studying, the time you're in class, And so that takes away the ability to work at a paying job. So college imposes an out-of-pocket cost of both time and money. This is a series of discussion questions. So you would speak to the opportunity cost, let's say, of buying versus leasing a car. Okay, well, when you buy a car, you're buying a depreciating asset, but at the point that you pay for it, it's yours. Whereas if you lease a car, it's like renting. Basically, you pay a monthly sum for a given period, often 36 months, and then you're going to return the car. Also, there is a deposit involved, so you have to kind of put a pencil to it. Which of these is more opportune for you as a consumer? And basically, it depends on what you feel in terms of your philosophy and driving habits. Uh, for some people, they'll drive the wheels off a car, so for them, buying is better. Other people may feel because they have a business and image is important, they'll go ahead and lease a more expensive car to project that image, knowing full well they're going to go ahead and turn that back in. Uh, they can also happen in investing, savings accounts, certificates of deposits, mutual funds, and stocks. So basically, the trade-offs would be safety versus risk. And so, uh, investors may choose differently depending on economic conditions that are prevailing. Going out to eat versus preparing food at home. Going out to eat is typically more expensive, but it's much more convenient in terms of not having to prepare the food yourself, not washing dishes, and cleaning up the mess thereafter. Where if you prepare food at home, there's a certain amount of time, cost involved in that. Also the cleanup along with the preparation. The difference between walking and taking public transportation. Well, it depends. Sometimes walking could be just simply faster. Other people might argue that walking is simply more healthy, depending on the kinds of distances that you have to travel and how much time it takes you to get there. Taking public transportation might be more favorable when you have to go all the way across town, even though there may be many stops along the way, and probably more advantageous if the distance is too far to walk in a reasonable amount of time. This brings us to marginal decision making and a diminishing marginal utility. You'll probably see something like this on the exam, so I would definitely know what these terms are: marginal analysis, utility, law of diminishing marginal utility. Basically what they're talking about is examining the benefit and cost of choosing a little more or a little less of a good in relationship to, let's say, another good or service. Utility speaks to satisfaction or usefulness that one places on a good, consuming a good or a service. The law of diminishing marginal utility is basically once you have enough of a specific good, the utility from each additional unit will actually decline. Let's say in the case of Alphonso, if he buys one burger, that may satisfy his appetite. The second burger might be still pretty high in the way of utility, but anything after that probably offers a great deal less of utility, and so he would probably choose to spend his money on some other good or service at that point. Here they illustrate the pizza eaten brings more satisfaction. The first slice is better than, let's say, the six. It's simple. The guy got full, and so the sixth piece may be one too many. The next term are sunk costs, and these are costs that are made that cannot be recovered. And this is for people and firms alike. Sometimes it could be frustrating, but most people understand that it's something that may just have to happen to propagate, let's say, a firm or a person's agenda. So it may be hard to give up on a new product that's doing poorly because money is spent in creating and launching the product. And so, uh, sometimes you have to carry on with a decision that probably isn't optimal. The lesson with sunken cost is to ignore past errors and make decisions on base of what will happen in the future. So effectively, once the sunken cost is made, you can't really look back so much. You might learn a few lessons from it, and that will help influence a better decision in the future. But that's pretty much the deal. You just have to learn from your mistakes. Another important pair of terms in the glossary of economics vocabulary is production possibilities frontier and social choices. So the production possibilities frontier is a diagram that shows productivity efficient combinations of two products that an economy can produce given the resource it has available. It's a definition. The slope of the production possibilities frontier also shows the opportunity cost. So these are actually two variables that work with each other. This graph shows healthcare and education production possibilities frontier. So you see at the top of the y-axis, there's healthcare. Over to the right on the x-axis, you see education, and you have the curve that shows possibilities of A, B, C, and D, and F. And then anything underneath the curve or along the curve is considered the production possibilities frontier. So we could choose any combination of healthcare and education as long as it falls on the curve or underneath the curve. It does, okay, so if you don't have enough resources to produce outside the curve, that's not a possibility. So anything above the curve requires more resources than you have. Anything on or underneath the curve says that you have enough resources to produce some combination along that curve or underneath it. And because the PPF is downward slope and left to right, only way society could obtain more education is by giving up some health care. So there's some optimal amount of health care and education that society will probably determine in this case. The law of diminishing returns basically means that as you use incremental units of resources to produce a good or service, the marginal benefit could reduce. And so the law of diminishing marginal utility is a more specific case of the law of diminishing returns. So satisfaction is really is actually the return, and utility is reference to satisfaction. An expansion on this illustration talks about the curvature of the PPF. And so it really could cut both ways. So as you give up more units of healthcare to gain more units of education, there'll be a diminishing return at some point. That also works in reverse. So as you create more units of education, there will be a diminishing return against the opportunity cost of, let's say, creating more units of healthcare. You will need to know that there are two major differences between a budget constraint and a PPF. A budget constraint is a straight line, and slope is given by the relative price of the two goods, which are fixed, so the slope doesn't change. The PPF, as you saw earlier, has a curve shape because of the law of diminishing returns. So slope is different at various points on the PPF. The absence of specific numbers of the PPF, well, the exact amount of resources an imaginary economy has it not known. So basically, it's purely for illustration purposes. This is not quantified in any way. So here we have a comparison of the two types of graph, the budget constraint and the PPF. Over to the left is an individual opportunity set. So you see the straight downward sloping line. Over to the right, it's a social production possibilities frontier. And so this is what society deems good. So that's a curve. Both diagrams show trade-offs in choosing one or more good at the cost of less of the other. So that's where the similarity lies. Productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. You'll probably see something like this on the test, I would imagine. Productive efficiency is basically when it becomes impossible to produce one more good without decreasing the quantity of another produced good. So any choice inside that PPF curve is considered productively inefficient because you're not allocating all your resources to produce that good. So anything on the curve is considered an optimal production, any point along that curve, that is. And then allocative efficiency is very specific. It says when you found the optimal mix of goods produced, represents the mix the society most desires. This slide illustrates a little bit more of what I was speaking about in the previous. And so you have an illustration of possibility frontiers of both health and education. So once again, the red curvature, any point A, B, C, D, or F, any point along there would be the optimal usage of resources because you're using all of them to produce either healthcare or education or some combination. However, at point R, you're underneath the PPF, and so it's not really particularly efficient because all the resources are not being used. So this is certainly possible. You can produce H1 and E1 and have a point R, but it's not really the most efficient because you're not on the curve. This slide talks about PPF versus comparative advantage. So a lot of this discussion kind of goes back to what we said about globalization. So how much a good country decides to produce depends on how expensive it is to produce versus buying it from a different country. So let's say South Korea is really great at making appliances and it costs them considerably less. They ship them over here to America and the cost for their good of similar quality versus a good produced in this country will cause the price to be lower. And so the tendency will be that, the retailer will probably import more refrigerators from South Korea and sell those because the margin's higher versus buying, let's say, refrigerators made in the US. So countries have different opportunity costs of specific good. Typically, it has a lot to do with climate, geography, technology, and skills. Also, natural resources, which is not mentioned. A comparative advantage is the term is when a country can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another country. So let's say Saudi Arabia or a lot of the Middle East has a comparative advantage in oil production because it costs them less to produce it than many other countries, particularly if you're in Europe or someplace where you really have no oil reserves. So you're kind of dependent on what's going on in the Middle East. The U.S. currently has a comparative advantage because of the recent developments in drilling. So we've become much less dependent on oil from the Middle East as a result of that. So we can say Saudi Arabia is losing comparative advantage against our own production in the U.S. This is an illustration of PPF and comparative advantage. So we have production per acre of Brazil and U.S. production per acre of both wheat and sugar cane. So if you take a look at the left graph, which is the Brazilian production per acre, certainly they are much better at producing sugar cane versus wheat. Take a look at the right, the U.S. production, we are much better at producing wheat than sugar cane. So we can say that Brazil has a comparative advantage in the production of sugar cane, while the U.S. has a comparative advantage in the production of wheat. It's also important to note that people, firms, and society do not act in a way that fits the economic way of thinking. Most people are not economists, that stands to reason. However, it is reasonable at first glance to analyze them with the tools of economic analysis. And we'll talk more on this in the later chapter on consumer choices. Also, there is the argument that people, firms, and society should not act in an economic way because the economic approach basically portrays people as self-interested. Economics is not a form of moral instruction. Also seeks to describe economic behavior as it actually exists. Uses positive statements which describes the world as it is. These are factual. And then it also tries to avoid normative statements, which describes how the world should be. These statements are subjective and are questions of opinion. So the people's choice to make their own economic choices has moral value worth respecting. Also, there is the principle of the invisible hand. As I mentioned earlier, in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, it's the concept of an individual's self-interested behavior could lead to positive social outcomes. So consumers will encourage businesses to offer goods and services that meet their needs. It is possible that the broader social good could emerge from selfish individual actions. And self-interest in economics does not always imply self-interest in all aspects of life. End of chapter 2.